Hey, Rob here for Quadratec.com. Today we're walking you through step by step how to install a set of Bushwacker flat style fender flares for a 2018 or newer Jeep Wrangler JL. Now we're going to need a few tools to get this job done. We're going to need a paint marker, an air saw or a pair of shears. A file will come in handy for cleaning up some of those cuts. We're going to need a ratchet, small extension, a 4mm Allen socket, a 9/16 deep well socket. You'll also need a pair of 1/2-inch wrenches, a pair of side cutters, a pair of wire crimpers, an impact driver with a Phillips head bit will come in handy. I also recommend you have some anti-seize on hand, along with an awl, a Phillips head screwdriver, a small flashlight will come in handy when we're working underneath the Jeep looking up inside of the fender wells. Of course, a pair of safety glasses to go with that air saw. And then we've got some nutserts that we're going to be setting as well. Now, if you're going to be using the included nutsert tool, well, you're going to need a 9/16 wrench as well as an 11mm socket. Or, of course, you could use something like the Smittybilt nutsert tool. So as you can see, we've already prepped our Jeep and we're ready to begin the install of our new Bushwacker flares. We went ahead and removed our wheel and tire and our factory flares. Now, if you're not sure on how to remove your factory flares, you can click on that info button to check out our Quadratec Academy video that we put together, where we walk you through the step-by-step process of removing both the front and rear flares to get you ready for your installation. The first step we need to go ahead and do is to set some nutserts into the sheet metal up front here that are going to be used to secure the inner fender support brackets. Now, one really nice thing about these Bushwacker flares is that there's no drilling required, meaning that they're using all factory existing holes in the sheet metal. That's really nice because it means we're not breaking any of the paint on here. We're not going to introduce any chances of rust forming on our fenders. Now, as you'll notice, there are a number of holes across the fender here. Some of them will not be used. Now, for our front flares, we are going to be installing 10 nutserts. And the easiest way to double check which holes are going to be used is to go ahead and grab the brackets, holding them into place, and you can match up the holes where you're going to be installing nutserts. Now, in the case of the center one here, we can see there's actually two. The rearward hole is the one that we want to install our nutsert in. We're not going to be utilizing this hole up front here. Now, Bushwacker does provide you with a nutsert installation tool. It's basically a bolt and a nut that features a knurled edge on the front here. You slip that nut over the bolt and then install one of the nutserts onto that assembly. Now we can go ahead and grab a 9/16 wrench, and you want to hold all that together with one hand, placing the nutsert into one of the holes in the fender. And then we can grab an impact driver with an 11mm socket. Now, you can do this with a ratchet, but I will tell you it will go much smoother if you have an impact driver. The tool will work better and there's less of a chance of messing this job up. Basically, you gotta have to hold everything together and you'll hear the tool start to strain as it compresses that nutsert. And right there, you can hear the tool strain a little bit. I know that nutsert has compressed. You wanna make sure that you don't over tighten that nutsert. You could run the risk of stripping those threads out. These are aluminum nutserts. Once it's in there tight, you can go ahead and back that back out. As you can see here, that nutsert has compressed and we've got that set in our sheet metal there. Now, there is an easier way, especially since we're going to be doing this job repeatedly. We're going to be installing 40 nutserts for this total set here. Something like the Smittybilt nutsert installation tool is going to make this job go a lot easier for you. Now, if you guys want to get more information or purchase a Smittybilt nutsert installation tool, you can click on that info button. I've already got our tool set up here to do the job for us. We've got our 1/4 mandrel installed in the tip of our tool. We can go ahead and grab another nutsert, install the nutsert onto the mandrel of the tool, and by simply installing the nutsert into the sheet metal, compressing the arms, opening them back up, we can unscrew that. And you can see we've got that nutsert set into the sheet metal. A much simpler job using the nutsert installation tool. It's going to make that job go a lot faster for you. Again, you can use that included tool if you must, but that Smittyville tool will make the job a lot easier. We're going to go ahead and finish up getting the rest of these nuts installed on the front, and then since we have the tool out, we're going to go ahead and move on to the rear as well. So here at the rear flare, just like in the front, we're going to be installing 10 nut certs around the fender opening. There are a few of the factory holes that we're not going to be using. There are 2 holes located closest to the wheel well opening, one on the back and one on the front here that we're not using. We're also not using this hole that's outside of the recessed fender area. And the only other confusing spot might be right here where we've got 2 factory holes next to each other. The quickest way and the easiest way to confirm which hole you need is to go ahead and grab that inner fender mounting bracket, hold that up, lining up the other mounting holes. We can see that we actually want this forward mounting hole. We're not going to be using this one closest to the rear of the vehicle. So we went ahead and we got our inner fender liner back in place here on the front fender. I secured it at the top on these 2 mounting tabs with the set of carriage bolts and a couple lock nuts. You don't need to tighten these down, we're just using them to hold the liner in place. I also used one of the factory plastic Christmas tree fasteners at the front here. And we've got to get this reinstalled so that we can mark it for trimming to use with the new Bushwacker fenders. You can use either a paint marker, a grease pen, really anything that's going to be easy for you to see while you're trimming this after you get it marked up. Basically what we're going to be doing here is marking a line on the inner fender liner that's going to be even with the sheet metal of the body of our Wrangler so that we can trim this down. When we get to the back here, you want to pay special attention that you've got the fender liner pushed all the way in against the frame rail here so that you can get a nice accurate line. You want to make sure you take your time with this step. Step back, look at it from a couple different angles to make sure that your line is even with that sheet metal. The reason we're doing this, we need to trim this back to fit inside of the new Bushwacker flares. So if we trim too much, well, the liner is going to fall out of those flares. It's not going to be secure. If we don't trim enough, it's not going to allow the flare to sit all the way against the body of the Jeep. So of course, it's always better to trim too little at the start. We can always come back later and trim a little more if need be when we get the fender up here. So I'm going to go ahead and get this marked up, and then I'm going to be using an air saw to trim the fender down. Of course, if you're using an air saw, make sure you're using some safety glasses. If you don't have that, you can always use a pair of shears or even a heavy-duty pair of scissors to cut this liner. The air saw is just going to make quicker work of the job. Now that we've got our inner fender liner all trimmed up, you can see I left a little extra past the marks that I made. We can go ahead, test fit that in there. Also, you see that I left these 2 mounting tabs intact, and I also left a little extra material up on the front here. We can come back and trim that off for an exact fit once we get the fender in place. But overall, I think we've got a pretty good fit on that. So we can set aside that inner liner right now. And then we're going to be going ahead and mounting these 2 inner fender support brackets. The one on the front sits just over these 2 tabs, and the one in the rear is going to sit and go all the way down. We're going to be attaching these into those nut certs that we recently installed into the sheet metal. And before we do that, you want to go ahead and grab this support brace that's going to sit on top of these 2 tabs here, and it's going to line up with these 4 nut certs in the sheet metal. We can just let that rest there for now. And we're going to be using these stainless steel button heads along with a washer to secure these brackets into the fender. Because we're using a stainless steel bolt and that's going into an aluminum nut cert, we definitely want to make sure that you're coating all of these fasteners with some anti-seize. That's going to help prevent any corrosion from forming on there, and it's going to make the job of getting them back out if we ever have to remove these later a much easier job. We're not going to run the risk of stripping out any of these nutserts. I'll also say if you're using an impact gun to run these in, be sure that you don't over torque them. You could spin these nutserts. So I'm just going to start them with the gun, and then I'm going to come back with the ratchet so that I can tighten them up later. When we're starting this, just get all of the fasteners in place first so that you can align the two brackets, and then we'll come back later and tighten everything down. Now we have one last fastener. We have this flange bolt, washer, and lock nut. And we're going to be using those to secure this front bracket to this front mounting tab here. And secure that from the bottom up so that we don't have the bolt hanging down below. Once you have all the fasteners in place here, go ahead and make sure that your fitment is good. Both the front and rear brackets line up with each other. Once you're happy with everything, we can go ahead and snug down all the fasteners and tighten up this front fastener with a pair of 1/2-inch wrenches. Now at this point, we can go ahead and grab these U-nuts, and we're going to be installing them along the bottom edge of these inner support brackets. There are 2 up here on the front bracket, and then there's going to be 1 more at the top here of the second bracket, and 4 more back here going down the back of that bracket. With all the fasteners tightened down on our inner support brackets now, we can go ahead and grab the last 2 U-nuts, and we're going to be installing those on the 2 factory brackets right at the front here, lining them up with the factory holes that were already in place. And just like with all the U-nuts that we installed on the inner support brackets, you want to make sure that this little lip is facing up, that the screw is going to be catching into. Then we can go ahead and grab those carriage bolts from earlier along with the lock nuts. We also want to grab a pair of these notched anti-spin washers. We can grab the inner fender liner, holding that up into place, and we're going to install one of the carriage bolts through the tab on the liner and then through the bracket and the brace. Install that anti-spin washer on top, and then the lock nut. And then we're going to do the same for the front tab. Again, the carriage bolt through the tab on the fender liner, through the factory tab and the support bracket, that anti-spin washer, and the lock nut. With those 2 carriage bolts secured, we can grab that Christmas tree fastener again and reinstall that right up here at the front of our inner fender liner. Now I can already see that I'm going to need to trim off some of this excess that I left up front here. We can grab a pair of the shears and go ahead and do that. Now we can go ahead and grab our fender so that we can test fit it and see if there's any areas that we need to trim a little bit more. I think we're going to need to trim a little bit at the back here, but again, this is where that taking a little bit at a time comes into play. You definitely don't want to take too much off of that inner liner. It can help to start the fender at the front here. And I can see that I need to trim a little bit off the back here, so we're going to go ahead and pull the fender out of the way, trim it up, and then we'll test fit again until we're happy with the fit of our inner fender liner. So now that we're happy with the way that our inner fender fits, it's time to go ahead and get the wiring out of our factory fender flare that we removed earlier. So as you can see, we've got this harness that's zip tied inside of the flare that we need to remove, and to do that, just grab yourself a pair of wire cutters, and we've got a couple zip ties to cut. One here, one more here, and one third one. And then if you grab a panel tool, we've got a couple Christmas tree type fasteners that we can remove. And with all those undone, the last step, and this might take the most nerve here, is to go ahead and cut this factory wiring. We're not going to be reusing any of the factory lights here, so we're going to cut the wiring right behind the front marker and the side marker here. And you just need to leave yourself a little bit of a pigtail on the end of each one there. And we can go ahead and set our fender out of the way. Now, if you grab a set of crimps, we're going to be using these bullet style connectors that are all included. We're going to be using 5 of them. We're just going to go ahead and strip back some of the wire from each of the 5 wires and crimp one of these onto each wire. It doesn't matter which wire or what order we do these in, all of them are the same. Just want to make sure that you're using all of the female crimps on each of these wires. Once we have the body side wiring taken care of, we can go ahead and set that aside and grab our fender flare and the 2 lights included with the kit that we need to install into the fender flare before we crimp any of the wire connections on here, because we do have this retaining nut on the back side of our marker light that we need to fish all the wires through, and once we crimp those bullet connectors on, it's going to be pretty difficult to get those through there. We'll put the wiring into this rubber grommet, and then we can go ahead and fish this onto the front of the fender. Now you don't have to worry about getting that marker light straight at this point. We can leave this a little bit loose and get it lined up once we're putting it on the Jeep. Right now we just need to go ahead and fish those wires through, starting with this little star washer. Followed by this plastic retaining nut. And then we can also fish the wires for the amber side marker light through this other hole in the fender. Now we can grab the 5 remaining male style bullet connectors and we can crimp those onto our marker lights. Now, while we have our fender up on the table, this is also a great time to go ahead and attach the rubber edge trim to the top edge of our fender. Now, to do that, we're going to grab one of the included alcohol prep pads, and you just want to give a good wipe to the inside edge of our fender here where that double-sided tape is going to be adhering. Once we've given that alcohol just a minute to evaporate, we can grab the edge trim and start by peeling off just an inch or 2 of the backing tape here. We don't want to peel too much. Once we get it situated on here, then we can peel the tape in small increments as we move down the fender to get a good fitment. And we can start right at the end of this kind of bump at the bottom of the fender. Right on the flat section is where we want to start applying. And now just working in a few inch segments at a time, get the edge trim seated and then pull out a little bit of the tape. And then pressing that double-sided tape to get a good adhesion to the inside of the fender flare. We'll repeat that again, just another inch or two, pressing it in place. And we'll just repeat that all the way down to the end of the flare. And when you get to the bottom of the flare, simply trim off the excess trim that's not needed and finish adhering that. And then we can move on to attaching our wiring here on the body side. We can simply reconnect that factory plug, making sure to push in that red locking tab, of course. And then if you like, you can just snake the wiring kind of up here behind that inner liner, pulling it out up near the front here where we'll make our connections with the new fender flare. But if you want, and the way I think I'm going to do it here, this inner fender support creates a really great channel for this wiring that'll keep it nice and protected, secure up out of the way here in the fender. And we can even reuse some of these factory Christmas tree type clips here. If we drill a couple little holes in the channel, we may have to notch this right here, but I think it'll look really good and keep our wiring protected. So that's the way I'm going to do it. There we go. With the wiring tucked into that channel, I think it looks really great. It's going to keep our wiring protected. Now we can go ahead and make our electrical connections. Grabbing our fender flare, you can kind of support that in the back here. And on that amber side marker, we've only got 2 wires to connect. And that's a simple black wire to black wire and red wire to the white wire. And then on that front marker light, we've got 3, and again, it's black to black, white brown to white, and the white green to red. With all those connections made, now we can tuck the wiring up inside of the front of the fender here. And then starting at the front of our fender, we can go ahead and fit that over the inner support. And as you work towards the back, just be sure that you're tucking that inner fender liner up into the fender, pushing the fender up onto the fender support. And once we have the fender on the Jeep, we can grab this little white plastic hook tool that Bushwacker provides that's used to fix any spots where that rubber edge trim got tucked under. Simply slide it behind the trim and move down the length of the fender, pulling all of that trim back up into place. Once you're happy with the way that looks, we can grab an awl and a flashlight. We just need to look up under the fender and line up those U-nuts with the mounting holes on the underside of the flare. I like to work one at a time. Once we have one lined up, grab one of the Phillips mounting screws and install that loosely. You don't want to tighten that all the way down at this point. And then I work my way around from one mounting hole to the next. Once I have all the screws in place and I'm happy with the fitment of the fender, we can go back and tighten them all down. When you're trying to line up all the mounting holes, it can be helpful to have a friend apply some pressure on the fender towards the body of the Jeep to make it easier to line up those holes while you insert the screws. Once all 9 screws are installed and we're happy with the fitment, we can go ahead and run through and tighten those down. And once all the screws are tightened, the last step is to install one of these push fasteners in the last hole down here on the inside of the flare. Now that we got that last push type fastener installed at the bottom here, depending on how well you trimmed your inner fender liner, you may have a gap showing. Now I like to do the extra step of drilling a 1/4 inch hole through the bottom edge of the fender liner and through this plastic bracket just below the one factory fastener there. It's the perfect place to reuse one of the factory push type fasteners. It's going to give you a great secure inner fender liner there. Now that we're buttoned up here, we can move on to the rear flare. Because we already went ahead and installed all the nutserts when we were doing the ones in the front, at this point we can grab our inner fender liner that we removed when we took the factory flares off. And we're going to be holding it back up in place here so we can mark it so that we can trim it for the new flares. I like to go ahead and grab some of these Christmas tree fasteners that we pulled out of the factory flares and just insert them in 1 or 2 of the holes at the bottom here. You don't even need to really fully install those clips. They're simply holding the liner for us while we can mark it, again, with that paint marker, grease pen, whatever you have handy that's going to be easy for you to see while you're making the trim. Hold it up in place, and we're just going to be marking even with the body of the Jeep all the way around. Now when you get to the 2 mounting tabs, one in the front and one in the rear, we want to make sure that we leave those in place. We don't cut them completely off. Now we can go ahead and pull those clips back out of the way. Again, grab a pair of shears or aerosol, whichever tool you like. We're going to go ahead and trim that off. Again, it's better to err on the side of leaving a little too much that we can trim later rather than trimming too much the first time around. Now once you're happy with all of your trimming, you want to ensure that these 2 tabs we left in place are completely flat because we're going to be sandwiching them between the body of the Jeep and the new fender flare. We can re-secure the bottom edge of this with those factory clips that we removed a little earlier on. Now, if your clips are either too damaged or totally broken at this point, we do have replacement panel clips available. You can click that info button to head over to Quadratec.com to pick up a few of these for your install. I recommend purchasing a few of these when you purchase the flares. That way you're ready for any clips that may break on you. Now we're ready to grab those inner fender support brackets. They're going to be labeled 1, 2, and 3 starting at the front. 1, 2, and 3. You can hold those up just to make sure you've got the correct one. It should line up with those nutserts that we installed earlier. And again, just like we did in the front, it's a good idea to put a coating of anti-seize on each one of these bolts as you install them, just to prevent any corrosion from forming in there. With all those bolts started by hand, now we can go ahead and snug them down, ensuring that each bracket is aligned with the next as we move around. And of course, it's a good idea to go back down and snug these up each by hand so that we don't strip out any of those nutserts. Now again, just like we did with those front flares, we have a handful of these U-nuts that we need to install along the bottom edge of these inner support brackets, ensuring that the tabbed side is towards the inside of these brackets and the flat side of the bracket is going to be on the underside. After getting those U-nuts installed, we can grab that fender flare, just kind of tuck it behind the rear bumper into place. Verify all of your cut lines. Now once you go ahead and make all of the trimming adjustments that you need to, there is one lower splash shield down in the back here, if you still have your factory rear bumper in place, that you're going to have to notch and trim as well. Now if you've replaced your factory rear bumper with an aftermarket one, you're not going to have this lower shield to worry about. Once you're happy with everything, we've got some more of that rubber edge trim we need to install on the outer lip of the fender flare. Just like with the front, we're going to start with the alcohol prep pad, wiping down the inside, and then we'll get that rubber trim installed all the way around. Now that we've got all of that weather stripping in place, you want to make sure this front tab on our inner fender is tucked up in between the body and this inner support. The rear, we're going to be putting a clip through the fender, the liner, and then into the body. At this point, we can go ahead and install the rear flare onto the brackets. Now, if you need to, you can grab that plastic trim tool again and run it behind the seal, ensuring you got a nice flat seal against the body the whole way around. Again, just like we did with the front flare, we're going to grab an awl and a flashlight, and we're going to use the awl just to make sure that each of these U-nuts is in position with the mounting hole on the underside of the flare. And then we can start to secure that with the Phillips head screws. Again, just secure it loosely. We'll work our way around. Once we have them all in, we can go ahead and tighten them up. With all the Phillips head screws tight, we can go ahead and install a factory Christmas tree fastener in this upper hole, ensuring that the inner fender liner is also in place to be secured with that clip. Then we can grab two of these push type clips, get that inner liner tucked up behind our flare. And finally, one last push type clip right here towards the front edge of the fender. That last clip wraps up the install on our rear fender flare here. I'm going to get the wheels and tires back on, and then of course repeat all of the same procedures over on the passenger side of the Jeep. Now if you guys have any comments or questions about installing a set of Bushwacker flat style fender flares on your 2018 or newer Jeep Wrangler JL, of course you can leave those for us in the comment section below or contact us directly at any of the options on the screen. You definitely want to make sure you hit that subscribe button so you're sure to catch all of our latest product review videos as well as install videos. Until next time, I'm Rob. See you guys out on the trail.